Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar all about having difficult conversations remotely. As Robin said, my name's Andy Coley, and I'm so pleased to be here with you, sharing some of my knowledge, some of the information about how can you have conversations that perhaps could be a little bit tricky. What can you do to make sure those conversations go really well? So my name, like I say, is Andy, and I am an NLP trainer, a neuro-linguistic programming trainer. And neuro-linguistic programming is all about the way that we take in information, how we process that, how that creates our unique map and our world, and how that comes out through our communication and through our conversations. And I'm going to be sharing with you some of the tips that I have recognized over the last 8 to 10 years that I've been doing NLP, and that I often speak about running diploma practitioner, master practitioner training in NLP. And I'm really happy to be coming here and doing these because I've been doing a lot on collaboration, a lot on resilience, a lot on stress. And as you can see, I'm also working from home. And I've had to have a lot of difficult conversations with clients, with suppliers, with stakeholders in other projects about how can we move forward through times that have been completely unique to 2020 for all of us. So what are we going to cover? We're going to look at how can you make a conversation empowering by overcoming resilience, how you can prepare yourself for any potentially difficult conversations, how you can frame the conversation in the right way so you both get the best outcome, and you're going to get the chance to interact and ask questions of yourself. Now, I'm going to pose a question to you straight away here. This is where I get to sit back for a couple of minutes and just wait for you to come in. But what do you think is the difference between having a conversation virtually or face-to-face? Because I'm really curious about what was it that drew you here today to learn about having difficult conversations? Or was the remotely bit part of it? Or is it actually just about having difficult conversations? So in the questions box, and Robin's going to read out a few of these to me in a minute, what do you think is the difference between having conversations virtually or face-to-face and in person with somebody? Is there a difference? Or is there something that's unique to the virtual environment that perhaps you don't get face-to-face, or something that's you always get face-to-face that you're completely missing by having to be virtual at the moment? And I'm aware that some of you are already back in the office and you're starting to socially distance work in a way that's kind of getting back to how you were working before. But a lot of us are still remote at the moment. I thought this quote would be quite interesting just whilst you pop your questions in there to just share. It's actually about being brave enough to start a conversation that matters most frequently. Because when we want to have a conversation that really matters to us, it can take a bit of bravery, a bit of courage, a bit of confidence to start to put what we actually want to have happen for ourselves across. And that's what this is all about. That's what this session is all about. And so, Robin, who's put anything into the question box? What kind of things have come up already for that? What do people think is the difference between virtually and face-to-face?
The comments are coming in thick and fast. A lot of people talking about body language. Sorry?
The body language. Yeah, so body language is one. Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Yep. Loss of personal touch. It's hard to have difficult conversation with people that you don't already have a long-term working relationship with.
Mm-hmm.
More formal online rather than can we have a quick chat? So yeah, so you can't just like pop next to someone's desk and just have a quick chat with them.
Yeah, that's really curious, isn't it? That whole thing about how do you start a conversation off? If you see them go for a cup of tea, I'm going and have a quick chat with them, whereas actually we have to go, please, can we sit down and have a Zoom meeting at this time and that time? And is your diary free and all that? And it becomes a lot more formal. There's a bit more build up. It's a bit like, your manager saying to you, can you come to my office, please? Kind of your mind goes, oh my God, what do they want to talk about? What might be going on? This whole load of stuff runs through people's heads. So yeah, I definitely understand that one, the difference between the informal chats, even if they were difficult before, versus the having to schedule things in. Anything else, Robin?
Yeah, this one made me chuckle. Don't want to shock someone with a video call and then confront them.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I mean, the whole thing around video calls, we're going to cover this during this webinar as well, is about having that body language involved with it. It can be so useful because so much of communication is non-verbal. That's what I teach a lot when I'm actually running my NLP trainings, about how much of our communication we can pick up from other people and how much we give away that actually really says to us about what's going on inside our head. We can't help but communicate. So when we're feeling something, we're also communicating it using our physicality. So that's why video conferencing, at least having to work from home, technology such as this GoToMeeting or Zoom or whatever, MS Teams, whatever your organization uses, does make a big difference for us to be able to connect, even if there is that little bit like I had with Robin there, that little bit of crossover of chat. I can't see that Robin's about to talk, and so therefore stop So therefore, I have to rely on other senses, and it can become a little bit jarred in our communication. And yet, I think we've all done pretty well to flow to the kind of new normal there. I'm going to talk a little bit first of all about conflict styles, because I think this is such an interesting thing. When I've been teaching courses about communication, and particularly when it comes to having difficult conversations, knowing your conflict style can be quite a curious thing. And so I'm going to put some conflict styles up here on the screen. And I'm just curious as to which of these styles you think actually might be yours. Now, this is based around a 2015 study that looked at what gives people stress in the workplace. At least 25% of people got really stressed because of interpersonal relationships. And the organization Thor, great acronym, I love it, did some work around the Myers-Briggs. Now, some of you may know Myers-Briggs as a psychometric test. You don't need to know Myers-Briggs for this part, but just recognize outside of those 16 areas of Myers-Briggs, they identified 5 different conflict styles that people may adopt, particularly when they're under pressure, about the way they might handle a situation. So I just thought it's worth exploring. When you think about having a difficult conversation, what's your immediate go-to moment? I'm going to tell you what mine is later. I just thought I'd go through the 5. Now, they are accommodator, they are the avoider, the collaborator, the competitor, and the compromiser. So the accommodator, well, they're more inclined to be a little bit less sensitive and maybe a little bit less assertive and really highly cooperative. They tend to avoid conflict and they want to be liked by other people. And there are advantages to having this as a conflict style because it does mean that actually they're able to start to accommodate other people's points of view, but it also means that you can be perceived as not standing your ground, that you might be taken advantage of. And you might leave the conversation perhaps a little bit unsatisfied. And so there's an aspect where it can be really useful, each of these styles, and also an aspect where maybe it's not quite so helpful. Now let's go on to the next one. The next one is the avoider. Now the avoider conflict management style tends to be unassertive and uncooperative. And if you use this strategy for yourself, you tend to not get your own goals met. Now, sometimes it's useful to use this as a technique, because if the benefits outweigh do you know what, it's just not worth it. Do you know what, the greater good, the relationship, the stakeholder, the person that's involved, the ego, the whatever it happens to be, do you know what, it's just easier to avoid this circumstance. But if you recognize that actually you're constantly avoiding conflict, then that's something to start to pay attention to. You're the bury of the head in the sand. Collaborators. In fact, I've done some webinars for IGD on collaboration. You can go back and watch those online. Collaborators can be great because they are very goal and relationship orientated. You're looking at helping both sides to resolve conflict situation. And you have to have a high level of trust in the other person, in the other party, in the other stakeholder, in order for this collaboration to work. So you have to trust that you've both got each other's backs. The greater good of what you're trying to aim for is better than individual goals. So therefore you can work. And it also means you have to get creative. Without that creativity, sometimes innovation can get stifled. You can find creative strategies, maybe using what you've got, but you might not go for the real fundamental new stuff. And I know, again, you've been doing a lot of work here, particularly with IGD, talking about innovation. Innovation has been so key for all of us, innovating the way that we handle ourselves or innovating the way that we work. Now, when you're successful at collaborating, both of you should leave content. You should both be happy with the outcome of the situation. Competitors. Now, they can be highly assertive and perceived to be uncooperative. And they really much more about their individual goals and the relationships. And these people can be said as being commanding, intimidating. They've got the ego. They need and have to win. Got to be the number one in that situation. Now, they have advantages. Speedy decision making, great in emergency situations, decisiveness. Do you know what? This is the strategic stuff. This is what we're going to go, and we're going to just go and do this. The competitor can be really good, rather than trying to take on everybody else's point of view. And what do you think? Now let's collaborate on this. Do you know what? We just have to make a decision. This is what we're going to do right now. That's where a competitor conflict style can be really useful. But it can put strains on relationships. So important concerns by members of the team might not necessarily be addressed, and it could lead to hostility and resentment. Or it may lead to highly competitive, where you've got competitor, coming in against each other, and it ends up with just 1, 2, 3 parties being highly competitive. And the final conflict management style is compromiser. Now, this tends to be assertive and highly cooperative, much more about collective goals. And if you do this and you go through the compromiser, actually, do you know what? You can get rid of conflict and sustain relationships and get to a resolution much quicker, but you can also be aware that you might be compromising some of your original goals. You might be compromising some of the project aspects. So each of these conflict styles has a pro and has a con. But what I'm really curious to know about yourself are, which are you most like? So we're going to pop up a poll, and this is Robin says, if you full screen, come out of full screen so you can see the poll as it pops up on the screen. And we're going to pop up on a poll on there. And I'm just really curious as to which of the conflict styles do you feel you are? You know, are you much more of the accommodator? Are you much more of the collaborator? Are you much more of the avoider? Are you much more of the compromiser? So we're going to pop that poll up on the screen now. Robin, you can just do that in the background. And I just want to get from you, what of those are you? Are you the accommodator, the avoider, the collaborator, the competitor, or the compromiser? Now, whilst you guys answer that poll, as I said, I was going to share a little bit more about what I was. And for me, the one I was most like was the avoider. When I found out about NLP and personal development and, you know, working with yourself a lot more, I was going through all sorts of things that were really causing me problems. And a lot of them had come because I was that avoider personality. I was that person who's burying my head in the sand. And trouble is, everything just comes up and kicks you from behind because you don't see it coming. And for me, that avoider strategy came very much because it was actually a learnt behavior. It was something that I recognize now that my parents would do and their grandparents did. We avoided talking about the difficult stuff. We had this big family rug full of things that we didn't talk about in our family. And that's where I learnt it from. So then when I was having trouble in business, when I was working for myself, or even when I had small teams, I would avoid talking to other people about things I needed them to do. And I would end up taking on all the responsibility for myself. I was literally putting it onto my shoulders. In my, I've been married twice. And in my first marriage, I was an avoider of conflict. That's what actually was the big problem. We didn't end up being able to talk to each other because I would avoid the conversations and she would get really frustrated and we would end up in this situation where we weren't communicating. And reflecting back now, knowing what I know, I recognize that's where we had a lot of problems in that relationship. And that avoider strategy really came with me until I started to recognize more about myself. And if I knew what it was doing for me, like what I was getting from that, which is often about protection, about not knowing what to do, about not having the answers, but also being too shy and not confident enough to ask for them, then actually the avoider strategy was doing things for me. And so by focusing more on myself and what I wanted and what I needed to get for myself out of life and in business, I was able to start to change that strategy. So let's have a look at what the polls said here. Robin, do you want to read out the results for me?
Oh, so let me just share them on the screen here. So we have, yeah. So go 26% are accommodating, only 7% are avoiding, the majority, 47%, are collaborating, 2% are competing, and 17% are compromising.
Brilliant. And I'm not surprised because I think in the field and the world that you've been doing, particularly when it comes to supply chain management, everything you have to be going through, if you haven't had that collaborating mindset, you probably wouldn't be doing what you're doing within these organizations. And I'm not surprised at that. And I think collaborating, compromising, and the accommodating, between those, they are the key ones to start to foster. But also be aware that avoider can be useful and competitor can also be really useful. So it's not that you shouldn't do one over the other, but it might be that actually you have an inkling to do one other than the others. And that's where the key thing's here. If you look up the 5 conflict styles outside of this and Myers-Briggs, you'll find a list that says, if you know, in terms of your psychometric profiling of Myers-Briggs, you can go, actually, this one is a bit more like me because I'm that kind of element within the Myers-Briggs grid. And so just finding out about it can be really useful. And for me, knowing that I was an avoider meant I could start to do something about it. I could take steps to actually put on my big brave boy pants and do something about it rather than avoid it. By then repetitively breaking the cycle that I had been in, I started to do something differently. So now I can have the difficult conversations with people. And it's been so much more useful for me being able to do that. Now, that isn't to say that I don't feel that initial inkling of, avoider, but because I recognize what I'm like when I'm being an avoider, I can then start to do something about it. The key thing, by the way, when you know much more about personal development, you have to keep developing yourself, which is always fantastic as an opportunity, and go, I can't get away with anything now. So I'm just curious about, in terms of what makes a conversation a difficult one. And it's focusing on that word difficult. Because what if you're just having a conversation? If you pre-perceive it's going to be difficult, then guess what's going to happen? It's going to be difficult. If you think you're going to be frustrated by somebody, you'll just pay attention to the things that make you frustrated. And that actually has much more of a mirror about what's going on for us. It says something about you if you pre-think that's how your conversation's going to go. And I just want to draw you to noticing about what kind of resistances might be coming up, internal resistance or external resistance. So when you're reticent about something, when you notice those internal feelings, like I was saying about being my avoider, that is a clue that there's a bit of resistance. You cannot get empowered whilst you have some resistance. If resistance is in control, if it's stopping you, then you cannot go and make that conversation happen in the way you'd like it to do. And change is much slower if there's resistance. If there's something holding you back, anchoring you down, weighing you down, it doesn't allow you to get into flow. And so that resistance can be a real key element. And it's natural and healthy to notice resistance. It's also natural and healthy to be able to go and seek assistance. Go and speak to your mentor. Who are the people that you would turn to for advice? Go and ask them about what they would maybe do in that situation. That can help you overcome resistance and know much more about what's going on for you. And also, everything is a learning opportunity. To be curious about what's being shared by other people and what that resistance means for yourself. Because if you ignore it, it can be dangerous. Then you can end up in those patterns. You can end up with stress. You take stuff on. And for me, that's what was happening. I was taking on other people's stuff. I was stressing myself out. I was working 80, 100-hour weeks. Health suffered, my life suffered, my marriage suffered, everything suffered, fundamentally because I was avoiding stuff and there was so much resistance that I couldn't overcome it. And that, for me, is what got me into doing this whole field about how do people work, how do their minds work, how do we tick, and how do we take in and process information? Because this is what I got really curious about within NLP. This is a model called the communication model. It's all about what happens during a conversation. We are being hit by billions of bits of information at any one time. So as you're listening to me and you're sat here watching the screen, listening to my voice, you're being hit by billions of bits of other information. The stuff that's happening maybe in your surrounding environment, in your office, in your home, whatever's happening around you. There's also your big left toe that I've just asked you to pay attention, and then to your right little finger. All these things still existed, but we have to filter these things out. We have to delete information, distort it, generalize it. We're going down into talk about neuroscience as an area of the brain, your reticular activating system. That does a lot of this processing. It takes things from your conscious mind into your unconscious. So we're being hit by more information than we can consciously process at any one time. That isn't to say that it isn't there, it's just that we might not notice it. Then we have a second set of filters. Values, our beliefs, things that we think important to us, things that we believe about ourselves or that we think we can and we can't do. Our memories, things that have happened before, previous decisions, the language that you use externally or internally with yourself, and these things called meta programs. These are all elements that actually make up part of how you process the world. And that world comes out through what we call in NLP terms, your map, your internal representation. Now, your internal representation is a byproduct of all your thinking. So that thinking creates that internal representation or map. Because there's no such thing as reality. There's just your version of what you think you've understood from a conversation. So when you're having a conversation with somebody else, recognizing that the way they're processing the world, the way that you're processing the world will be completely different. What's obvious to you is not always obvious to them. Now, I'm just going to share a quick TED Talk here that gives a little bit more information about what I mean by that.
So imagine you're standing on a street anywhere in America, and a Japanese man comes up to you and says, excuse me, what is the name of this block? And you say, I'm sorry, well, this is Oak Street, that's Elm Street. This is 26th, that's 27th. He says, okay, but what is the name of that block? You say, well, blocks don't have names. Streets have names. Blocks are just the unnamed spaces in between streets. He leaves a little confused and disappointed. So now imagine you're standing on a street anywhere in Japan. You turn to a person next to you and say, excuse me, what is the name of this street? And they say, oh, well, that's block 17 and this is block 16. And you say, okay, but what is the name of this street? And they say, well, streets don't have names. Blocks have names. Just look at Google Maps here. There's block 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. All of these blocks have names, and the streets are just the unnamed spaces in between the blocks. And you say, okay, then how do you know your home address? I said, well, easy. This is District 8. There's block 17. house number 1. You say, okay, but walking around the neighborhood, I noticed that the house numbers don't go in order. He said, of course they do. They go in the order in which they were built. The first house ever built on a block is house number 1. The second house ever built is house number 2. Third is house number 3. It's easy, it's obvious. So I love that sometimes we need to go to the opposite side of the world to realize assumptions we didn't even know we had, and realize that the opposite of them may also be true. So for example, there are doctors in China who believe that it's their job to keep you healthy. So any month you are healthy, you pay them. And when you're sick, you don't have to pay them because they failed at their job. They get rich when you're healthy, not sick.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because one person's map, even the way that one person sees the world, even the one person, lays out their addressing, in terms of the streets and the layout and the way they number their houses, is different from one part of the world to the other. But it's obvious to you because you know it. If you've grown up in that environment, if that's just been how it is for you, it is easy and obvious for you. But if somebody else who's new comes in and they've got a different map, a different way of seeing the world, it will take them a bit of time to adjust. So often difficult conversations are because we have different maps. Because these maps, from an NLP perspective, go on to actually start to control the way that you feel, your emotional state. And that emotional state has a knock-on effect to your physiology, what's happening within your body. And that comes out through your behaviors. So what you're seeing and hearing, you then filter through your perspective, through your experiences, through your map, through what happened last time you spoke to that person, you had that conversation, or what that company's like when you're working with them. All of this stuff goes on, and then that comes out through your behaviors. And of course, in conversation, these things actually affect each other in the same way. So your emotional state knocks onto what you're thinking about something, your physiology control your emotional state. That's why if any of you here do yoga or mindfulness or meditation, breathing, those kind of, breathing is good, by the way, but kind of like long, slower breathing that can be nice and calming for you, meditative kind of breathing, your behaviors will change as a result. You will feel differently. Even just taking 10 long, deep breaths before you have a conversation that you want to go into that's really important for you, having that will have a knock-on effect to the way that you're seeing the world, and therefore what comes out through your mouth, and then how you behave. So just recognizing we have different maps can be part of the key. And so what you want to do is gather more information about the other person's map of the world, because there's no such thing as reality. Two people will not see the same thing in the same way. Take an example, like you remember the time when we used to be able to go to the cinema. They'd sit in the cinema screen, and onto that screen they would project the film. And the two of you who are seeing that screen, seeing that film together, will have completely different experiences or expectations of it. Take my wife, Sophie. If I go and see a Marvel action film, I'm pre-sold. You have to stick the label Marvel on it. I'm there, watching the CGI fest of superheroes flying around the screen for 5 hours or however long they are these days. I'm already sold. Just stick me in there, give me some popcorn and a drink, and I'm perfect. My wife, bored to tears. She'll watch them at home, not interested in cinema. It's too loud, it's too noisy, too quick. Ugh. She'd rather watch something that's got a little bit more intelligence to it, let's put it that way, than a Marvel action hit. But my map is showing me and filtering that film in a particular way before I even get in there and after I've seen it. Whereas hers is already pre-selecting what she might think about that experience and how she's going to filter that. So being curious about another person's map can be the key. So to do this, you have to get in rapport. Now, your words are only a tiny part of being in rapport with somebody. So if you're just texting, if you're just emailing, if you're just writing messages on Slack or any of the other things that Asana tasks or whatever you're using for your communication in your organization, the words are only a tiny part of communication. The tonality, the way that you say those words are also key. They're very important because you can infer a lot from the words. So if you heard some tonality, then actually you think, oh, I would have taken that in a different way if I'd heard them say it. And then finally, the physiology, the body language, as was already said at the start of this. What's the difference between face-to-face communication and virtual communication? Is you could tend to lose a physiology if you're not using things like video conferencing. And building rapport is really key, that we have all of these elements where you can. So if you get the opportunity, video calls can be really good when it comes to having conversations and you want them to flow, getting rapport. At least having a phone call with somebody can be the next best thing if you can't meet them face-to-face or virtually. And if you had to, the worst one is the words. But if you need to, just think about what might be going on for the other person as they receive to those words. And when you're having a conversation, listening is that key skill, that ability to be able to listen and listen at your best. But we don't always listen at our best. And sometimes time is a factor. You're trying to squeeze things in, get it done. I just fire off this quick email before this, and we don't really think about it. And time can be a key factor where we don't listen at our best. Sometimes you have conversations with yourself. You kind of pre-think, do you know what? I'm not going to have the conversation because they're going to say this, they're going to say that. This one, that second one, that was a big pattern of mine in the past. I wouldn't have difficult conversations with people because I'd have pre-thought what they were going to say. And then I'd be surprised because if I ever did have that conversation with them, I'd be like, oh, I wasn't expecting that. And so those conversations with yourself can blow things out of proportion before you've even had the opportunity. We don't always then listen at our best because of that. We can get distracted, trying to do things with distractions around us with the kids. Believe me, I live in a house. We've got 3 kids here. Distractions, can add up when it comes to having those conversations that really matter. Or you pick a bad time or a bad place, or you pick a bad medium. You're trying to do it just through email or Slack or something like that, rather than, do you know what, let's just get 10 minutes on Zoom, or we'll save hours of us both thinking about that conversation in the wrong way. And also think about your own outcomes. Sometimes we don't listen because our own outcomes are at play. Are we trying to understand too much? You're trying to get too much detail, too much of the why. You're spending too much time on the problem rather than on the outcome. You can get digressed if you're trying to overly understand something. Sometimes we're trying to fix, but we're trying to fix without permission. Somebody might just want to share something that's going on, and we immediately go into problem-solving mode. But that's your solution, not necessarily their solution. The best change work from people when you're coaching or you're mentoring them comes because they own their solution. So working with them to not necessarily fix, but just listen can be part of it. Sometimes you can be disagreeing or finding fault before the person's even spoken. Whatever they're going to say, because you've seen that email, you've read that report. No. You don't listen about maybe where they're coming from. What's their map? What's their take? Because it breaks rapport. One of the key words, and I mentioned this on other webinars in the past, but I share it, is the word but. You're using the word but with somebody, it really creates a barrier. If you're saying to somebody, I hear what you're saying, but my point of view is this. It's like you're saying, I've got your point of view, but you need to listen to mine. It's actually using the word and. I hear what you're saying, and my point of view is this. And builds the bridges, and but creates the barriers. You just pay attention to your buts. Kind of wave a little flag every time you hear one coming up. And if you're thinking, yeah, but Andy, that's you using it right now, you might as well just say no. It's quicker. And it can cause conflict if you're already disagreeing and finding faults. Or you want to please people. You want to rescue them, you want to please them, you want to make them happy. And that, with all of these things, we don't then necessarily listen at our best. We can even become a bit of a victim with trying to please other people. We don't point our point of view across. We try and become too accommodating. We end up trying to please the other person. So the key thing is listening with curiosity. I take every conversation as an opportunity to unwrap a little gift, particularly when I'm coaching people or training in environments when I'm running training within organizations. If you take everything as the opportunity to unwrap a gift, this person has information and they're giving it to you. They're telling you something. They're sharing what's going on in their head. The intimate information about what they're thinking is coming out through their words. Treat it as a little gift that you can unwrap. Find out more about it. If you do anything after these kind of webinars, find some education around building rapport and listening really well. Get in touch if you want to, because these are key skills that are really, really useful to develop as a manager, as a person, as a communicator within your relationships. So every opportunity is about being curious and unwrapping that gift. And for me, I think about what do I need to be when I'm listening at my best? Because believe me, there are plenty of opportunities when I'm not listening at my best, when I'm frustrated, when I've got a behavior where I've switched off and everything's not happening the way it's supposed to be happening and blah, blah, blah. And you end up, I kind of call it my little 5-year-old temper tantrum. Had one of those Sunday. Stepson's supposed to be going back to school. He started Thursday, Friday. Sunday evening, get the text message from school. One of our staff members has got coronavirus. School's not going to be open for 2 weeks. Oh, okay. Great. I wasn't listening at my best at the point of view we had that. And I had to go, right, what can we do to shape the week and change things around? And I went into problem solving mode at that point. But at the initial time, what my wife was saying to me was not being absorbed very well. I wasn't listening at my best. But when I am listening at my best, or environments like this, when I'm training, when I'm coaching, when I'm working, and I really want to get to know the other person. So for me, when I'm listening at my best, I'm like a sponge. I'm just absorbing information, like a sponge absorbs water. People are saying stuff to me, and I'm not just sat there like a sponge. I am nodding and paraphrasing and saying things back and asking good questions, and I'm just absorbing the information. It's data. They're telling me about their map. They're unwrapping their present in front of me. But I'm also finely listening. I'm listening to both their language, an ear trumpet, by the way, for anybody that doesn't recognize. So I'm like a sponge with an ear trumpet. I'm really finely listening to what they're saying and not saying. I'm listening, in a sense, to their body language, to the things that they're doing along with what they're saying, the way they're communicating with their hands or with their eyes or with their voice. All of these things, their tonality, their pauses, they are important bits of information. So when I'm listening at my best, I'm like a sponge with an ear trumpet. So I'm curious, again, pop this into the questions. If you had a metaphor, like a sponge with an ear trumpet, for you when you're listening at your best, how and when do you listen at your best? Or if you don't have a metaphor, you don't do metaphors, that's fine. Is there a particular time of the day or a particular situation when you listen at your best? So again, just pop those into the questions and Robin's going to give me a little bit of feedback. Robin, do you want to feed these ones back as they come in? I know they'll shoot fire. There's loads of you on the call now. So.
Yeah, they're coming in. Let's run through them very quickly. Oh, someone's got like a meerkat, alert and attentive. Before 2 p.m. Listen best first thing in the morning when I wake up early and prepare for the day. When I'm undistracted. Late afternoon or very early morning. Best when I haven't been interrupted from something I'm working on. When I'm preparing to have the conversation. When it's a subject I'm interested in. When I feel confident in the situation. When there's no little people asking.
When it's open and honest, I saw as well. Yeah, nothing going on in the background. Yeah. So these are really interesting things, isn't it? Some of you say like I'm in the morning or before 2 p.m. or when when I'm not being interrupted. So these are key things to pay attention to. If you know what it's like when you are listening at your best, have the conversations when you want to be able to listen at your best and put strategies in place that allow that to happen. So have your important meetings in the morning if that's when you're better. If you're one of these people where your energy changes at 2 p.m. onwards, for me, I'm very much similar. If I want to do creative stuff, if I want to get in my zone and just get going with stuff, then the mornings are far better for me. By 2, 3 p.m., my mind's in distracted thought process mode. That's when I do my admin type tasks, things where I don't have to think about it too much. So if you know what you're like when you're working and listening at your best, put your meetings, whether they're remotely or face-to-face, in those times. If it's about not being distracted, stick the sign on the door and tell people to go away, or just the office door is shut. When the office door is shut, then this means something. When it's open, please come in and chat. All those kind of little strategies can make a big difference. But knowing how you and when you listen at your best can be really important. So putting some of this stuff together, first of all, truly listen. When you're having those difficult conversations, truly listen. Know that what is obvious to you is not obvious to the other person. Just think back to that TED talk. What's obvious to you is not obvious to the other person. People are reacting to their map of reality and not to reality itself. There is no such thing as reality. There's your perception of what you think you've seen or heard or felt. There's my perception of what I think I've seen or heard or felt. And somewhere in between those two is our version of our truth. But that truth is not reality. Any of you that came along to any of the webinars or the masterclasses that I ran last year, we got you to draw a map. And if I was to get you to draw a map now, between wherever you're stood watching this right now, and maybe the front entrance to the nearest building that you've got, or the front entrance to, your wherever you're situated, as I did when people came along these webinars, everybody in that room drew a different map. They drew different elements, they drew different directions, different seat layouts. Some of them knew the location really well. They drew a detailed map. Other people had no idea. They couldn't even remember what floor they were on in the building. All these maps were different, but reality was reality. The structure of the building, the concrete, the physical locations, the chairs, all of those things were reality, but people's maps and their interpretations were different. So always recognize that when you get in a conversation, your map, my map will be different. And every behavior for that person has a positive intention for them. So if that frustrated or that behavior where maybe they don't feel like they're taking it in, that is giving them something positive at an unconscious level. They might not be aware of it. You just recognize that it's going on for them. I say to people, if you're trying to give useful bits of information or bits of information that need some time to be processed, maybe give the information and then say, do you know what, let's go and grab a drink and come back in 10, 15 minutes. Now that process of going away, stepping away, doing something and coming back means that person's got a bit of time to do its processing. Our dreams are when we do our processing. Our daydreaming is when we do our processing. Processing is important. You can't constantly be on go, 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 go. Your unconscious mind needs time to do its processing, to think about things and reflect on stuff. That's often why after something you've had a conversation, you think, oh, if only I'd said this, that, and the other. So maybe give some opportunity. If it's a really important meeting that you're having one-to-one with somebody, give some time for them to process it and then come back and discuss it. Once you've handed over, once you've passed on what it is that you want to say. The meaning of communication is the response that you get. If somebody's not understanding you, it is down for you to put across the information in a way that they can understand it. So it isn't that they've not interpreted it right, that they've not got you. It's that you have not communicated in the way they need it to be communicated in. And what motivates you might not motivate other people. What's important to you is not necessarily important to them. And also think about, is there a scope for a win-win? Now, there's loads I could go into terms of negotiating models and other elements that I can share within this. But if you think about it, when you're having a negotiation with somebody, then often there is a point at which you would walk away from that negotiation. Let's call it your no deal. A little bit relevant at the moment. There will be a no deal situation that's going on for both parties. And there is also the point at which, do you know what, this would be my ideal best outcome. And somewhere between your best outcome and your no deal, and their best outcome and their no deal, is some overlap. But where is that win-win? Where is this bit in the middle that maybe you can come to as a compromise, or that you can accommodate each other? Is there a win-win? A good way of thinking about this, of preparing for it, is to step into their shoes. And this is a great, fantastic little NLP technique. And some of you might be NLP practitioners out there, you'll recognize this one. It's called perceptual positions. So it's about thinking about something from different points of view, different perceptions. Because normally in a conversation, we think about things from our point of view. What's going on for us? How we're feeling, how we're thinking, what we're doing right now. And if you think about a conversation, maybe you've got coming up, think about a conversation that you're going to have today or that you've just recently had. What is going on for you right now? What's happening in your wider world? What are you thinking? What are you feeling? What are you acknowledging about that? What's going on for you? Why is it important that you have that conversation? Now, typically, that's how we go into conversations. But of course, there's another party in this conversation. There's the other person or persons or organization, whatever it happens to be. That other person also has their point of view. They have their perception. They have what's going on for them, how they're thinking, how they're feeling, what's going on in their wider world. And the whole idea is, of course, you have some empathy with the other person. And that empathy allows you to get to understand them a little bit more, stepping into their shoes, thinking about things from their point of view before you have the conversation. And typically, this is where we stop. We go, right, this is what's going on for me. I think I know a little bit more about what's going on for them. And okay, then we're going to have the conversation. But there's a real art to this, is to actually take a third position. So what I would normally get people to do is write down everything that's going on for me and everything that's going on for the other person on two separate sheets of paper. And I'd put the sheets of paper in front of me or put them up on the wall. And then what I would do is get them to step into what we call a third position. Now, this third position is the unbiased fly on the wall. And this unbiased fly on the wall, think of this as like being the kind of logical space. All the emotions kept on the outside in those top two positions, and all of the logic is in the middle. And from this unbiased fly on the wall, if you were somebody that you knew was really good at handling this stuff, that had been there and done it and solved it, it could be somebody that you know, somebody that you even don't know, it could be somebody famous, books you've read, you may have a perception of how that person might handle the situation. If you were them, having heard these two people have that conversation or go into that negotiation or prepare for that interview, whatever it happens to be, what advice would you give to those two people about what they could do differently or what they could do about that meeting they've got coming up? And actually write down the advice. You look at that person and you look at yourself and you go, right, what advice could I give these two people about how they could have a good conversation that's going to be proactive? Because having proactive, outcome-focused conversations, the key to avoiding them becoming difficult. And pre-thinking things through can be really, really useful for that. So stepping into these three positions, from you, from them, and as an unbiased fly on the wall, and analysing a conversation or something you've got coming up from those three perspectives can be so useful. And I coach and take teams through these entire processes. There was another process, it's not dissimilar to this, that I shared recently on one of the IGD webinars about the Disney process. It's about stepping into 3 different positions when you think about things that allow you to kind of get out of your own head and get stuff down. I always invite people to write stuff down. If you externalize it, if you put it down on a piece of paper, you can step back from it. Using physical space can be really important. So when you think about that thing you've got coming up, you think about it from your point of view, the other person's, and what a guru, what your advisor, what your inner mentor would give you, then start to listen and tap into that advice. And that's you giving yourself advice. Nobody can tell you how to have a better conversation. Only now can you decide what comes next in a conversation. And it's about doing the prep work. The more prep work that you do, rather than just going off sort of half-cocked into a conversation, having a conversation that means that you haven't really thought things through, you haven't built the rapport, that you haven't put it in the right time of the place, that you're doing it at 4 o'clock in the afternoon when you already know that you're going to hit your zone of not listening by 2. Having these things in place makes a really big difference to how those conversations go. So for me, it's always about the prep work. And now we've got some time for some Q&A. So if you've got some questions, if you've got anything that I've covered today that you'd like to know a little bit more about, or anything else in terms of difficult conversations, please pop those questions into the box. And I'm going to get Robin to come back up onto the screen, and he's just going to facilitate this Q&A session for us before we close the webinar. Thanks, Mark.
Right. Well, let's see what we've got. Andy, that was a really good session, by the way. So much to take away from it. I think we've all benefited from this, and we still have 150 people on this, which is fantastic. I did actually have a question that came through during the conflict style section of the webinar. Is there a trend for people who are competing to hope they're collaborating whilst coming across as something else?
Sorry, just say that one again. It sounds like cut out.
Yeah, so I'm looking down on my notepad. Is there a trend for people who are competing to hope they're collaborating whilst coming across as something else?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? It's what's the competing doing? Like, what's the competitiveness about? Because if it is about compromising, or is about collaborating, or is about the greater good, competing person is always about their end goal. Yeah, and they kind of want to get everybody else out of the way and get their goal and make sure we've achieved it. And now I'm the winner. Now we can bring in everybody else's little bits. But actually, that's not really collaborating. You have to trust other people. So if you already have a competitive mindset, it's doing, okay, right. If we were all winning, if we were looking about this as not about the goal, but it's about the problem we're looking to solve, or the outcome we're looking to get, then how can we make sure that we best fit in with that? But that conflict style, the competitive is actually very energetic. Yeah, it's quite often, it can be great. I mean, I definitely get into competitor mode when I want to as well. I want to win something, particularly with Joe, my business partner I work with on the NLP training. We're both competitive people. You take us to a pool room, we'll play pool very competitively. But when it comes to working and training and collaborating and creating new ideas, we're very collaborative. It isn't about one or other getting their way or being the person whose idea gets used. It's actually about, what are we looking to achieve within the business? What are we looking to achieve for the outcome that will benefit the people that work with us? And therefore, what's the best thing that fits within that? And kind of letting go of egos and just sitting back and going, do you know what you just said was a great idea. There's a really good way of phrasing it. That's a great, way that we can market this. Let's go with that and see what happens, And then we've got these as other ideas that we could use in the future. And so that way, you allow other people to make sure their ideas have been heard. You acknowledge what they've been saying, and you're bringing in about the fact that actually, it's about the greater project good rather than individual competitors.
Okay. I hope that answered that question. We've got some more that have come through, and I'll get through as many as I can. Can you provide some tips for having a difficult conversation with more senior colleagues?
Again, the more senior colleagues, the seniority is partly in your head, to be honest. It's about having the conversation that you need to, just having it, right? The more that you ruminate on it, right, the harder it will start to get to have that conversation. So it is about picking the time. It is about picking the place. It often is just saying and asking or doing whatever it is that you need to have a conversation about. Seniority is, it's there within the organization, but they are still individuals. You pick anybody, they are still people going through the same stuff with their still mindset, with their own imposter syndrome stuff going on, with all their, with all their mindset they've got. just because they happen to be senior to you does not mean that you should alter or change the way that you have the conversation. It's always about rapport. It's always about listening. And it's always about thinking, what is the outcome from this conversation? What is it that I would like to have happen as a result? And then sharing everything you need to be able to start to make that happen and listening to what they say as a result. And they will be aware of other stuff that you're not. They will be aware of budgeting and team sizes and what's happening within the bigger part of the business that maybe you're not aware of. And those are all factors that they're filtering your information through, but you're putting it across. And that's where that perceptual positions bit can come in really useful. To think about things, knowing what you know about that person who's senior to you, and the way they usually take in information and what they would like to hear, and just do what you can to put stuff across in a way where they will listen. And where you're also coming to them with solutions, not just problems. This is one of the key elements to building a coaching-led team. So if your team's always coming to you with the problem, going, this has happened, and I need you to fix it, please. Here you go, I'm going to hand you my problem. Most people go, oh, now I've got more work to do. Whereas if you go, do you know what, this problem has happened. This is why, this is what happened, right? And what I think we could do about it is this or this. What do you reckon? Now the person's going to go, okay. They're not focused on the problem. Now they're focused on the solution. So becoming more solution focused when you're talking to somebody, rather than giving them a big sack of problem, coming to them with here's the sack of problem, and here's what we can do to sort it out, then that can be very different when you're speaking, particularly when you're speaking up through the levels.
And Andy, what are your tips on simulating creating the casual conversation remotely? If you have
Simulating. To be honest, what do you know about that person already? How can you? And it's not just how's your dog, or go cool. How was your weekend? Just get chatting. Right? Conversations flow when we're in rapport. So you can do some things to be in rapport. So one of the key elements are when you're talking to somebody, use their words back to them. If they say they've had a really busy weekend, you go, oh, why was it so hectic? It's like simple things like that. They didn't say it was hectic. They said it was busy. You go, oh, okay. Well, what? How was it busy? Using people's words back builds rapport. You can do some stuff to match and mirror physiology. It's a little bit trickier when you're sat down with somebody, on a Zoom call and so forth. But even things like little head movements or nodding and all of those kind of things. We have these things called mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are in our brain. They like similarity. They're looking for similarity. You always know when conversations are in flow because people are not mismatching or out of body language with each other. And so, you will find that conversations will flow just by simple little techniques, by using body and using your language. I wouldn't probably simulate it. I would just get on and do it. So,
if someone's asked here if you feel the other person isn't being fully honest in the conversation, how can you check or ask without creating further conflict or mistrust?
So, I haven't shared it here, but there's a good model that you can use that's around feedback, which is called the clean feedback model. So there's something you are seeing or hearing that is giving you some intuition that they're not being honest. Or there's something else that you've seen or heard in the background that you already know about that hasn't been mentioned or has been mentioned in a different way. Let's put it that way. Maybe you're perceiving they've not been honest. So always go back to the evidence. What is it that you see or hear? And what is your interpretation of that evidence? Because if you say to somebody, I know that you're not giving me the whole information, and that's really frustrating. If you start talking to somebody, trying to give them feedback, and the feedback is about emotion, about the impact on the business, emotion tends to get met by emotion. Oh, no, I didn't. I've given you everything, and we end up in this, like I say, my little 5-year-old thing carries on, and it explodes. Whereas if you go, do you know what? I read an email from somebody the other day that mentioned, not quite what you've just said here. Now, I've inferred that maybe you didn't know about that, but let's discuss that part of it. Let's discuss what got mentioned somewhere else, or even going on to, do you know what? As I'm talking to you, I can see something about your expression, or you kind of gave a particular, you looked in a particular way, or you're not finding the information that I need you to find. I'm interpreting that as maybe that you don't know everything about what's going on. Let's talk about that. So go back to the evidence. There's something that you're seeing and hearing. Think about when we process the information, and you are interpreting that differently to the way they're interpreting it. So when it comes to honesty, if you know something, if the knowing is either an instinct, there'll be something they're doing non-verbally, it's giving you that clue, or if the knowing is because somebody else has told you something, or you've seen something somewhere else, and so therefore you know that your interpretation and that person's interpretation is different already, then just talk about the evidence, then have a conversation about it. If you talk about evidence and your interpretation, you end up having a discussion quite often about the way that you're seeing things differently, the way the interpretation is different, but it doesn't end up escalating into an emotive subject. So I would always go back to the evidence and the inference in those situations.
Okay. We've got time for one more question. So this is the final one today. Do you have any tips on having difficult conversations online when it's harder to read body language?
Again, I would just really do all that you can to read the body language. You can still read so much, even just from the shoulders up. You can pay attention to people's breathing. If people are in a fear state, flight or fight type state, their breathing will be quite noticeable. They'll be breathing much higher up in their chest. So pay attention to the shoulders, okay, not people's chests. Pay attention to the shoulders. So if they're breathing high, often the shoulders will be moving much quicker. If they're much more relaxed, you might not notice any movement at all. If people are internally relaxed, you can see it quite often in their face. If you know somebody well, you will quite often know the difference between them being in an agitated state or a not agitated state. So there's lots that you can still pay attention to, even the way that people's tone is. Yes, are they much more calmer and considered? Or they're trying to get information across really quickly. What is it that they are saying through their body? And some of it, to be honest, it's about practice and about knowing more about what you can notice through body language. But we all know the people that we work with quite well. We all know, for instance, if our partners, even from the way they close the front door when they come home, or they park up on the driveway, quite often we already know what their internal state might be like. And so therefore you pick up and perceive a lot of information for people unconsciously. So trust your instincts. Trust your instincts, and then just allow yourself to go, right, okay, that's a bit of information. I don't know it's fact, but it's a bit of information. What can I then do to start to do something about it? So even shifting and changing your breathing, if you notice somebody's quite anxious, just by introducing some more pauses into the conversation, just sometimes breathing a bit deeper and putting it in there so that you can slow the conversation down, quite often you can pace and lead people into feeling just that little bit calmer by using your body and even your tone of voice, just bringing that down. That tone of voice can actually allow people to feel differently. Because if you're constantly going in at this kind of rate of knots and people are getting very frustrated and you're kind of communicating this way, actually people feel a lot more anxious when it's like this, because it's like, I've got to take in all this information, it's too quick. So use your body and your voice, and you can pace and lead people through different emotional states without screaming, obviously.